In this tutorial, you'll learn how to create a drop-down menu with HTML and CSS.
Alright, so this is what we're going to create, and I have opened up a simple project here in my code editor, which is Visual Studio Code. So the first file I'm going to create is an index.html file. I already have this image SVG file for the logo. That's this logo. So here I'm going to press Ctrl B to close the sidebar. I'm going to type HTML, pick the second option, press Tab, which will give me an HTML boilerplate. I will quickly change the title into something like drop-down menu. And then we're going to need a couple of things. So we're going to link to our own style sheet. So that's going to be a style.css file. I'm going to quickly create that here, style.css. And then let's see, we're also going to need a different font, right? So the font that we're using here is called Inter. It's a very popular font. So you can go to fonts.google.com. So this is my go-to font. Like I said, it's very popular. It looks very good, I think. A lot of designers use it as well. So here I'm going to pick the light, regular, medium, semi-bold, and bold. And then you have to click on the icon here and it will show you how to include that. So I'm going to copy that and paste that right here. I'm going to hold Shift-Alt-F to format everything. So the first two links are just for optimizations, and then the third one is what will actually give us the font. So then we can close out of here. Okay, so let's think about, and actually before we do that, let's just try opening this up. So I'm going to hold Shift, I'm going to just click this and hold it with my mouse. I'm going to hold it up here in my browser. I'm going to zoom a little bit. Let's see, I'm zoomed 125. Yeah, so it's the same now. So now we can work on the HTML. So what we're going to have is this navbar here. Let's start there. Let's just try coding this without the dropdown first, right? So we're just going to add the HTML without the dropdown. So it's just going to be a header, right? So we can write header.header. It will give us the header element, including header as a class. Now in there, the content should be a bit restrained in terms of width, right? So you can see the header itself with the background should have all the width, but the content in there should be a bit restrained. So it's a good idea to have some kind of content div that will hold the content, and we can restrain the width of this element, and this one can still be 100%. So in there we have a logo. Typically you want to be able to click on the logo. So it's going to be an anchor tag. Then in there, it's going to be, the actual logo is going to be an image. So it's going to be image, logo, __ image. Right, so I'm using BEM notation here for my classes. This is a very clean, structured way of naming your classes. And it's just one of many aspects that you need to know about CSS. So also Flexbox, CSS grid, animations, and transitions. If you haven't mastered those things yet, you really need to master those as a web developer. Definitely check out my professional CSS course if you want to take that CSS skill to a professional level. You can find the link in the description. Right, so here I'm just adding the image here. And then we have those actual links. Right, this is actually going to be the nav. Right, so we have a nav tag. The nav tag is for important blocks of navigation. So then in here, typically it's structured like this. So you have a list. And in the list, you have list items. Right, nav item. And then in there, you have the actual link. Right, so it's quite nested. But this is a clean way of structuring it. So here, let's say we have projects, right? Projects, company, and solutions. So I'm going to place the caret on this line. I'm going to hold Shift and then up arrow key twice. And then I'm going to hold Shift Alt down arrow key to duplicate these lines. So this should be company and this should be solutions. Okay. So if I save this and refresh, we can see this stuff on the page, right? It looks terrible right now, but we'll style this in a second. All right, now I don't want to keep refreshing whenever I make a change, right? Because then we have to save and we have to refresh here. So I'm going to use a live server extension. This is called live server. It's very popular by Whitwick Day. You can install that and then you can right click on your HTML file, open with live server. It will put the project on a live server, meaning it will automatically refresh whenever you make a change in your HTML, CSS, and also JavaScript. Okay, so let's go in the CSS here and let's style this, what we have so far. So I'm going to make it a little bit smaller here. All right, so I like to start off with a simple reset. So I will add some comments here to my CSS just for some structure. So we can select all elements with the universal selector and we can remove all margin. Right, all padding, we're just starting from a clean slate, right? Because the browser adds some default styling to a lot of elements. For example, these anchor tags get a blue color and underline. We don't want that. And then also we don't want the margin and padding. Now, typically people also set the box sizing property to border box. This is actually a very advanced property. Most developers don't understand it. I have a separate video on that if you want to learn what that means. So then we also We will also select all other elements. We will remove the underline, so we'll say text decoration none, and the color should be inherited. Right, so it should just be the dominant color on the page, not the blue color. Now this list still has bullet points. We don't see it because it's sitting against the edge, but we don't want any bullet points. So we're gonna say list style none. Okay, so that's for a reset. Let's also add some base styles. So we're gonna select the body element, and here we can set the font family, right? So we've linked to the inter font, but we still have to set the font family on the body, and then it will be inherited by the other text elements on the page. Now, if inter is not available for any reason, for example, maybe the server is down, we can provide a backup font after the comma here. Now, we don't have a specific one. We can just say sans serif, which means pick any sans serif font that is available on the user's computer. Right, so now if I save here, you can see that the text has become a different font. Okay, so now we're gonna add a background image. So you can find all sorts of beautiful images on unsplash.com. I found this one. I'm gonna copy the URL here, and I'm gonna say background image. I don't have to write out the complete property name. I can write background I. It will suggest background image for me. I can press tab, and then it's URL. I'm gonna paste that URL, right? If I save here, let's see what we get. All right, so then we get this, which is not completely right, so it's not the proper size yet. So it's currently too big. So we can say background size, right? I only have to write background S. That will suggest size for me. And then cover, which will cover it. Now, due to the dimensions of the image, it's a bit wider than it is tall, which means you're gonna have some space left here, and the browser will try to fill that up by repeating it. We don't want any repetition, so I'm gonna say background repeat, no repeat. But then you have some white space below the image. We're going to remove that with background attachment fixed, which will make the image go down all the way. Now we do want the position of the image to be centered both horizontally and vertically, so that then also when we make it smaller or bigger, it stays centered and it doesn't move sort of out of the page, right? So now we have a responsive full screen background image. Okay, so now we can actually work on the navbar. So let's continue here. So those are base styles, right? Then we have the actual styles or normal styles. So let's just start with the header. Let's give it that background color. So we can just background color or just a shorthand background. So that's going to be RGBA 19, 22, 26. And then the fourth value can be for the opacity. So let's try 0.7. And you can see if we do this, we can make it 0.2. We can play with the transparency here, right? Maybe 0.6 looks a little bit better. I'll use 0.6 here. All right, so then let's see what else we need to style here. So of course, the logo should be a little bit different, links. So let's just add all the classes that we added here. I like to just get it over with. So we have header, and then in there we have header content. And then in there we have logo and logo underscore underscore image. Then we have nav with all those nested classes. Right, so we have nav, nav list, then nav item, and nav link. And those are all that we need for now. So let's make the image a little bit smaller, so we can just set a height of, let's say, 20 pixels. And an image is an inline level element by default, so it's going to have some weird space, white space below it. So I like to make it a block level element to remove that white space. All right, let's also make these links a little bit easier to read. Let's give them a whiter color, and they should be a little bit transparent. So we can make it white, right, 255 all the way. But then the last value can be 0.75, right? So it blends in a little bit better with the background. All right, so then let's work on the layout. So when you work with layouts in CSS, you want to think Flexbox. Flexbox should really be your go-to way of solving most layout problems. There are some more complicated layouts as well in which you should be using CSS Grid, right? So it's really important as a web developer, especially on the front end, that you have mastered Flexbox, CSS Grid, animations and transitions in CSS. So definitely check out my CSS course if you haven't mastered things like Flexbox yet. But just as an example here, so we want the logo, right? So with Flexbox, you have to identify the parent element. So we have the logo here and then the nav here. So the parent element is this header content. So what you can do is you can go to header content and you can set the display property to flex. And the default layout is that they're going to sit next to each other horizontally, right? Now we also want them to be vertically aligned. So we can do that with align items. So we can say align items center, right? And then we also have justify content in this case to deal with the horizontal alignment. So we could say, well, they should sit in the center, for example, or maybe all the way to the end. Right now, in this case, we just want space between. Right, so you can use justify content here to deal with the horizontal alignment. Now, if we look at the example, this has to do with responsiveness, but it's good to quickly show you this. When I make it full width here, my browser, you can see that the navbar, the content here does not go all the way to the edge here, right? So the width of this content is restrained because people, like, it's not comfortable for the user if the content is all the way on the sides because people's field of focus is more in the center, right? So we want to restrain the width, right? So right now with us, it's sitting against the edge. So that's why we did this with this header content element, because now what we can do is we can say the maximum width here should be 1200 pixels. When you do that, the maximum width of this header content is 1200 pixels, but the header itself with the background color is still 100%, right? This is what we want. Now this 1200 pixels should be in the center though, so it should be centered. So one trick in CSS here is you can use margin auto. So you can say 0 on top and bottom and an auto on right and left side. This has nothing to do with Flexbox. This is just a trick in combination with max width, which will center that 1200 pixels in there, right? Now, when we make the viewport smaller, right, so on smaller devices, it's still going to sit against the edge, which is not what we want, right? So in the example here, it's sitting a bit, there's some padding here, right? So we should also add some padding here. So 0 on top and bottom and 30 pixels on right and left side. And this will actually already look pretty good in terms of responsiveness, right? So wide viewports, this looks really good. And then on smaller viewports, it looks good as well. It will never sit against the edge, right? So this is already part of responsiveness without any media queries, but this is already very good. Okay, now the navbar here is a bit darker, so let's actually just make it 70% just so we can copy the example. I still think that looks good as well. So here, they should sit next to each other, these nav items, right? That's the layout problem, so you want to think about Flexbox, right? So you have 3 nav items here. Their parent element is the nav list. So what you can do is say display flex. Right, they're currently sitting here. If I save here, they sit next to, this is the default layout. They sit next to each other horizontally. Now there should be some space between them as well. So we can use column gap. This is also Flexbox. We can set that to something like 40 pixels. All right. Now, of course, there should be more height, right? So we can just set a height on this header content of, let's say, 60 pixels. All right. And actually for responsiveness, it's a little bit better to use minimum height. Because when we, on very small devices, for example, we may want to put these links below the logo. And then the header may be slightly taller than 60 pixels, right? So then this is a little bit more suitable because it will work with that as well, right? I have a separate video on how to create, a really solid responsive navbar from scratch. You can check out the playlist. That's all we need for now. That's not really important here for this video. All right, so then let's work on the hover effects for these links. And actually, we want to make them a little bit smaller as well. So I can write font S, press tab, 15 pixels. And maybe I'm going a bit fast here with the CSS, but because I just want to get to the drop down here. But you pick that up. Once you've mastered CSS, this is all pretty easy. So definitely check out my professional CSS course. It takes a couple of hours, but it will benefit you for the rest of your career. Okay, so when we hover these nav links, so nav link in the hover state, let's say we want to get a background color, right? So in the example here, let me make this a bit smaller. So in the example here, when I hover these nav links, you see this background, effect, right? So we can just say background color. Well, it should be white. It should be white actually. So 255 all the way, but then with 10% opacity. So then when you hover them, you can see there is this background stuff. Now it's a bit small, so we can just add some padding here. This should be in the normal rule set, not in the hover. So it's just 7 pixels on top and bottom, 14 pixels on the left and right side. So then we get this. And actually when we do that, it adds a lot of space between them now, right? Because now they have additional padding. So it's probably best if we reduce this a little bit. So this column gap, instead of 40 pixels, let's make it 20 pixels. So then it's sitting a little bit closer to each other. Now it's not the exact same as in the example here, because here in the example we have this, it's actually not going to be, it's actually an HTML entity, but it's like an icon, which takes up quite a bit of space actually. So that's why it looks a bit different, but this is very close already to the example. Now what we also want is when we hover it, that the text becomes completely white, right? So not with lower opacity, but just 100% opacity. So when we hover this, we can also say color well, just white, right? So then it becomes the exact same effect. Now we're gonna make this responsive as well, right? So with your drop-down menu and even a sub-menu, we wanna make sure that we also pay attention to smaller devices like mobile. So let's also think about responsiveness here. We haven't added the drop-down yet, but we'll get to that in a second. We can already make this responsive. So what you can do, and actually, let me show you an example of what we're going to do. I can right click, inspect, and here you can play with the size of the viewport, right? So this is what we call the viewport. It's the visible area of the web page, right? So if I close out of here, this is the viewport, right? It does not include the address bar, right? All this browser stuff is not part of the web page, right? Only what we see of the web page, that's the viewport. It's different from the screen resolution, right? So screen resolution is everything you see here. It's just from my monitor, complete width, complete height. The viewport is smaller, right? It's only the visible area here. And when you deal with responsiveness, usually you're gonna play with the width of the viewport, right? So here we can play with the width of the viewport and it shows you how wide the viewport is. So usually what you wanna do is you wanna make it smaller and smaller until at some point you're gonna see that something's gonna crash, or at some point you can see here we have to change something, right? So then you pick like a breakpoint. So here we pick, let's say 650, and this is what we want at 650 and smaller, because then it will look good all the way into the smallest mobile devices, right? So how can we do that? Let's see in our project here. So we're gonna see at, let's say 650, right? So we're gonna write a media query. So it should probably be at the end of the style sheets. So here we can have media queries. So what you write is add media. For smaller devices, we want a different layout here, right? So for smaller devices, and we pick 650, but you can have a slightly different size. So when the viewport is small, so let's say when the viewport is at most 650 pixels wide, then we're gonna have some special styles. So this is like a mini style sheet, right, in here, but it will only be applied if this condition is true. So in here, we can change that layout in the header content, right? So this header content should become a vertical flow, right? So it holds the logo and this nav, and right now it's horizontal flow. That's the default direction in Flexbox, but now we want to get a vertical flow. So we can change the flex direction here to column, right? So Flexbox is also really important for responsiveness, as you can see, right? So we can easily switch up the layout here. So then let me actually make it a bit smaller. So then we also want to add some space on top and bottom right now, right? Because it's sitting against the edge. So we can say padding of 25 pixels on top and bottom and 0 on left and right side. Okay. And then we want to have space between the logo and the nav as well. That's just Flexbox again, row gap in this case. 18 pixels. Right, so you can see how easily we can switch up the layout with Flexbox. So it's really, I want to emphasize this, how critical it is that you have mastered Flexbox. So definitely check out my CSS course. It takes a couple of hours, but will benefit you for a very long time. So then what else can we do here? We can make the space between these links a bit smaller. So we can say nav list. The column gap here should be 10 pixels on smaller devices. And that's pretty much all that we want to do for now. Right, so it looks a bit different here because we have the icon here in the example, but you can see it will also work for the menu, and it will also work on the submenu. Right, this view in the example here can be buggy sometimes here in the inspector tools, but it's also working for the submenu here, right? So we'll make this work as well. But let's simply think about adding a drop-down menu here for wider viewports, right? So in the normal view, how can we add a drop-down menu here? All right, so what we want now is when we hover, for example, the solutions link, and we'll work with the other links as well if you want that, but let's take solutions here. If we hover that, let me actually make it a little bit wider. If we hover this, we see this drop-down, right? We'll make it responsive in a second. So how can we do this? Let's go to our HTML. What we need to do is here in our nav, we want to do it for the solutions here, right? So we're going to do a couple of things with this nav item. We're going to add a class here called Dropdown. And then we're going to work in here. And let's actually start off by adding the icon here. So this is actually not an icon from Font Awesome or something. This is actually just an HTML entity. So there are certain characters that are a bit difficult to type. For example, the copyright. Symbol is a bit difficult to type. So HTML helps us out here. So what you can write for the copyright is, for example, ampersand, copy, semicolon. And this will give us that weird copyright symbol, right? We don't want that. Here we actually want a different one. So it's the following that we want. So they always start with the ampersand. They always end with semicolon. So we say ampersand hashtag x25be semicolon. It's actually going to be sort of a triangle. pointing downwards, right? But that's what we want in this case. So then we have this. We don't even need to include some icon set. This is just what we get out of the box. Okay. Now a dropdown is basically just another list of links. We probably are going to have another list, right? So we can have another list. So we can say UL, and this time it's not going to be nav list, but it will be dropdown list, right? And in a UL, what do we have? We have list items. So we have dropdown item, right? And then in there we have the actual link. So we have dropdown link, right? Won't go anywhere here, but this could be solution one, for example. I'm going to put my caret on this line. I'll hold shift, go up twice with up arrow key, and then I'm going to hold shift alt down arrow key to duplicate these lines twice, because let's say we have 3 solutions. Right, so it's already getting a bit complex here with the nesting of the HTML. That's what you're going to get with menus and submenus and dropdowns. We're not going to work on the submenu now. We'll do that in a second. Let's just get a simple dropdown on the screen. So this is our HTML right now, right? So we have a nav list, and one of the nav items right now is going to be a dropdown. Okay, so actually we can already see it. So when I save here, you can already see that it has been added to the HTML, right? Now we need to style it properly. So let's see. Let's go to our CSS, and I will do it after all this nav stuff. So we have these class. Let's just add all the classes first. So we have dropdown, we have dropdown list, dropdown item, dropdown link, and I believe that's all. Let's see, dropdown list item and link. Yes. All right. Now it's already being displayed, but initially, of course, it should be hidden, right? So we'll do that in a second. Let's just make sure that it's styled properly. So it should have this white background color. Let's actually do that. So this drop-down list should get a white background color. So we can say background just white, and it shouldn't be taking up any space like that. So we're going to say position absolute to take it out of the normal flow and to position it more properly where we want it. Now, when you start working with position absolute, what we're going to do, for example, is say it should sit 0 pixels from the left. But the left of what exactly? So you want to have a reference point. So this list is going to be 0 pixels from the left of what? Well, it should be to the left of this nav item or whatever we use the drop-down class. So we're going to make this the reference point, meaning we're going to make this position relative. Right, so now it's back again. And it should also sit, let's see, a little bit more lower, right? So you can say something like top 50 pixels, but ideally we use a relative unit here because the content here could be in different sizes. And ideally we have the same, if we look here, you can see that the top of the drop down here coincides exactly with the bottom of that background color, right? So I think that looks pretty slick. And actually for our case here, it seems to be slightly different, but I think it's simply because we haven't styled the rest yet. We'll take a look in a second. So let's take a look what else we need to do here. So of course there should be much more padding, right? It shouldn't be so close. So what we're gonna do is for each of these items, we're gonna add some padding. So 10 pixels on the top and 15 pixels on the right and left side. All right. Now also when you go over there with your mouse, the entire item should get that cursor, that pointing cursor. So we're going to say cursor pointer. All right. Now it's going to wrap. By default, it's going to wrap. Right. So here it doesn't wrap. So that's simply because of it's going to set the width of this list. And so the text is simply going to wrap. And that's not what we want. We want the dropdown to be at least to be wide enough so that the text doesn't have to wrap. So a trick here in CSS that you can do is you can set a minimum width. Right, so we could set a minimum width of, let's say, 500 pixels, but that's too much, right? We can see it's too much. It could also be 300 pixels, also still too much. Maybe 100 pixels. That's not enough. So a quicker way of getting the result that we want is we can say max content, which is it's gonna take the biggest size that this text can be, so basically without wrapping, and that will be the minimum size of this dropdown. Right, a bit of an advanced trick, so definitely check out my CSS course if you want to learn a lot about these advanced tricks. Then one other thing I want to add here as well is a box shadow. Right, it's not really mandatory here, but typically I like to see a box shadow with the dropdown, so I can write box, sh, press tab. So here it's going to be 0 pixels offset vertically, 5 pixels offset, 0 horizontally, 5 pixels downwards. 10 pixel blur, and then it should be black with 0.2 opacity. All right, this is already starting to look like something. Now, I think the font size is a bit big here. So if you look at the example, the font size here is a bit smaller. And I think that's appropriate because the dropdown, the text in there, you know, it's less important than the main links here, right? So it should be a little bit de-emphasized. So of course, you know, one way of de-emphasizing something, especially text, is just to set a smaller font size. We can just set a smaller font size here at drop-down level. It will be inherited. Let's just set it to 14 pixels. All right, that's already starting to look quite similar. Now, one other thing is when we hover these items, we should get that background color as well, right? So when you hover a drop-down item here, we're gonna say in the hover state, drop-down item in the hover state, we want to get like a grayish color. So we'll say RGB 234 all the way. But then when you hover it, you get a nice visual indicator that you're hovering that particular item. All right, we'll add more solutions. This is a submenu in a second. We now have these three solution links. Now, when you hover this drop-down list, we should not lose this hover effect from the solutions link itself, right? So if I hover here, it still has that background color, right? That background hover effect. Here we only have it when we actually hover the nav item, but also when we hover the drop-down list, it should still have that effect, right? So let's see, where are we adding that effect? Yeah, so here nav link. When we hover the nav link, it gets the background color. But we can add another selector here. So these declarations should also be applied when we hover the drop down itself, right? So when we hover the drop down, also select the nav link and apply these declarations, right? So you can have multiple selectors, right, for the same declarations, for the same rule set with a comma. So here we're saying when the drop down is in the hover state, select the nav link and apply this background color and the color as well. So now when I hover here with my mouse, it's also adding that style to it keeps that style basically for the nav link. All right, and actually looking at it very precisely, maybe it's because I'm zoomed in, but it looks like the dropdown is a little bit too high. It doesn't sit perfectly at the bottom of that background color. So let's see. Yeah, so it should be a little bit lower. Now it's a bit nitpicking here, but you know, that's how it is sometimes in web development. So if we go to the dropdown, let's see, dropdown list, it's sitting 125%, but that's not enough. Maybe it should be 126%, maybe a little bit more. Yeah, so let's just do 130%. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see what I'm doing. Right, so now it's perfectly at the bottom of that rectangular shape. So it's a bit cleaner, but you know, these are just small details. All right, so this already is a dropdown. Now, of course, it should not be visible initially, right? So now we've styled this, but this list initially should be hidden. So now we're gonna go to drop-down list again, and we're gonna see how to hide this. Let's see. Yeah, so you have a couple of options in CSS to hide something, right? So you can say opacity 0. This will work. The problem is that it's still there, basically. You can see when I go over here with my mouse, it's still there. It's just opacity 0. There's also visibility hidden. Which is a bit of a stronger measure, you could say, to hide something. It has certain downsides, but we want to use display none here, which is like the strongest measure you can take to hide something. And then when we hover this, we want to undo that essentially, right? That's how it's going to work. So what we're going to do is when we hover an element with dropdown, then we're going to select the list and we're going to undo that. So we're going to say dropdown in the hover state, select the dropdown list. And to undo that, we can simply make a display block again, which it is by default, because it's, let's see, it's actually an LI, but doesn't really matter here. If we just make a display block, it will be visible, right? So now when you hover an element with a class of dropdown, which this element has, nav item solutions, it should become visible again, yeah, right? And when you go out of it, it should become display none again, right? So that's working now, all right? So this is a simple dropdown. Now, of course, we have to pay attention to responsiveness. Right, so here we have to check whether it's going to look good on smaller devices as well. So already, you know, you're going to run into an issue at some point. Let me actually make it very wide, because let's say that you have more like longer text in there, right? So let me see. You could have longer text in here, right? Something like this. So then already pretty quickly, you're gonna run into an issue here, right? So maybe already pretty wide. let's say 1470 or so, you want this drop down to be more to the left, right? Because right now it's sort of going off the page here, but maybe it should be aligned more to the left. We're gonna write a media query here. It should be before the other one. So we're gonna say when the width is a bit smaller, like 1470 pixels, we already want to do something with the drop-down list. So what we want to do here is we want to reset that left property. We can set it to initial, and then we can say it should sit 0 pixels from the right. And what that will do, you can already see it. It will sort of align it more to the left, right? So now it's more properly aligned with this button as well. But on very wide viewports, we still have this layout, which I think looks a bit better. But then, you know, already pretty quickly on laptops and things like that, smaller laptops, it will already be aligned to the left. And maybe you're actually watching this video on a smaller laptop. So then, well, maybe you cannot even make it bigger on your actual viewport. That's okay. But I hope you get the point here of already making it a little bit more aligned with the button and the rest of the nav. All right, but responsiveness doesn't stop there, right? So then we also have to check on mobile and devices like that. So let's make it smaller and smaller. So at some point, well, we have this layout, and let's actually see an example what we should get when we get to this size. So it's 631. So this is actually what we want on smaller devices. And this is what we have. Doesn't look bad, but especially on mobile, you do want to have like the full width and a more stacked layout. So we're going to change this. Let's see. I'm going to make it a little bit less wide. So here what we can do in this other media query, so 650 pixels, we can select this drop-down list. And we can simply say the width at this point should simply be 100%. Let's see, why is that not working? Okay, so for some reason it's not getting 100%. So let's see what's going on. This is what I would do in the real world. So we get width 100%. It is indeed applied. For some reason it's not getting that. We have some kind of error, but that's an unrelated issue here. All right, so I figured out why it's not working. It has to do with the position property. So it's a bit complicated, but this drop down has a position of relative, right? So when we use top and left here, it's relative to this drop down element, and we should change that here, right? So now it should, when we say top 100%, that shouldn't be relative to the drop down. It should be relative to this, because we want it to be perfectly positioned below here. So this top 100% should be relative to this header content, right? So now we want to make the header content the relative, the reference point, you could say, right? So at this point, it should be 100% from the header content. And so we have to undo the position relative on that drop down. So let's say drop down position. We did relative before. We want to reset that. So we can just say initial, and then you can see it is positioned. So I'm also going to remove this weird blah blah. That was just to showcase how it would look when you have more text in your links, right? But now you can see this is a responsive drop-down menu. It will look good all the way until, well, the smallest size that you typically want to support is about 320, right? So on iPhone 12 Pro, you would see something like this. You can flip it around and the media queries will automatically respond to that, right? So this is a very nice responsive drop-down menu. Now let's say this is not enough for you. Maybe you also want a sub menu, right? So that's what we're going to look at now. So you have 3 links, but maybe then another link which opens up another menu, a sub menu. We're going to look at how you can open this from the right side as well as on the left side, and of course also how to make it responsive. And just as a side note, this solution doesn't only work on the third nav item here. You can use this drop down, these classes now on any nav item, right? So the only thing you have to do now to add this drop down is we can copy this list, right? And let's say, right, we can remove drop down here, and let's say it shouldn't be the solution, but it should be project. So you need to add the drop down class here, and then you can just paste the list of links. Now, if you want to get the icon as well, you also need to copy over the icon here to projects. The icon does take up quite a bit of space though, so you can see it sort of moves the other one quite a bit. But then this one would be the drop down, right? And it would still be responsive as well. So we now have like an easy reusable way of adding a drop down to your nav items or to your nav, right? But you can already see it's starting to get quite complicated also in CSS with responsiveness here. So it's really important if you work with the front end that you have a very good grasp on how CSS works and many other things like Flexbox, CSS grid, animations and transitions, which we haven't really discussed here, but there's so many other things, little tricks that you need to know in CSS. So definitely check out my professional CSS course if you want to take it to that professional level. Same goes for the JavaScript, by the way. We haven't used any JavaScript here, but let's say, you know, we want to have some hover effects that are a little bit more complicated, or we want to have, you know, not a transparent navbar anymore. When we scroll down, it should become a solid color. There are thousands of little things that we could do here in the view in the browser as well with JavaScript. So if you want to take your JavaScript as a web developer to that professional level as well, check out my professional JavaScript course. Both of those links are in the description. All right, but let's stick to this third link. So I'm going to undo all of this, and then we're going to look at a sub menu, right? So let's see. Okay, so now let's try to add a sub menu. So we're going to have another entry here in this dropdown. So let's see. We're going to have solution 1, solution 2, solution 3. And then let's say we have another one, which will say something like more solutions. And so we need to copy this dropdown item. The fourth one is going to say more solutions. And this one will also have an icon. But let's see if this works. Now we have more solutions here. Now what we want is when we hover this, it opens up a sub menu. So this is going to be quite advanced. So bear with me here. So what we're going to do is first let's add the icon here. Let's just start simple here, right? So now it's another triangle, but it's pointing to the right. So we can use another HTML entity for this. So that's the following. It always starts with an ampersand, these HTML entities. And then we have, so ampersand, hashtag x25b8. And that ends with a semicolon always. So let's see. Okay, so now we have, oops, no, that's the example. Right, so now we have this. Now a sub menu is actually just another list of, well, links, right? So we need to pick one of these items in which we're gonna add that. So let's, that's what we did here, right? So we have the fourth one. This is going to be the sub menu, and then it's going to be the same structure. So you're going to have a list, right? So it's going to be another list in here. It's going to be sub menu list, right? So make sure you added this sub menu class here. So this is going to be sub menu list. Then in there we have sub menu item, right? And then we have the actual link, right? So this could be solution A, right? Let's say we have two items here, solution A and solution B. So I'm just going to copy that. And then we have solution B. Right, so this is what the HTML structure is going to look like now. Then this will get very complicated, especially if you want another submenu, right? So this is as far as we'll take it, but this is the HTML that we're going to need. And then let's go to our CSS. We actually don't have to write many new styles because the submenu, if we look at the example, actually it has the same styling as the dropdown itself, right? White background, it has the hover effect. So we can actually reuse a lot of that styling. So if we look at dropdown list, right, with the white background, box shadow, initially hidden, right? We actually want the same for the submenu list. So we can simply tack on another selector here. We can simply say submenu list should get the same. When we hover the submenu item, we want to be able to see it, right? So here, let's see, at some point, we have to show it. So when we hover an element with the submenu class, we need to undo the display none, right? Because here in this, here we're saying display none, right? So when we hover the submenu, when we hover drop-down item, basically this more solutions item, we should see the submenu. So here we should say display block, right? So let's see. Now we can see the submenu. Now the submenu is not positioned properly, right? So now we need to, let's see, we do need to style it a little bit. So we have the submenu class itself, and then we also have submenu list. So let's see, this should sit, well, where should it sit? It should sit 0 from the top. The top of what exactly? Well, that's going to be the submenu. So we're going to make this the reference point. All right. And it should also sit 100% from the left. So that it will be perfectly positioned there. We do need to give it some more padding and things like that. Let's see if we can just take some of the styling from the drop-down items. Yeah, so here drop-down items, we had padding, so we can just make this the same for the submenu items, right? So you can just add that there. And then you can already see it's starting to look very similar to the example. Right. So this is already starting to look very good. So we do need the hover effect. So here we have drop-down item hover. Also, when we hover the submenu items, we want that. So submenu item hover should be the same, right? So let's see. All right. So then we have our submenu, right? It's a very simple example. We're going to customize it a little bit now. let's say you don't want it to open on the right side, but it should open on the left side. So let's see how we can do that. So you just have to play with these numbers here. So maybe it should sit 100% from the right, right? And then of course the left property should be different, right? So actually that doesn't work. So let's see why not. The left. Yeah, so here we're saying submenu list, right? So here it's getting 0 from the left, right? So we do have to sort of undo that. So we can just say left initial, right? And then it will open on the left side, right? So maybe you prefer that. You can also change the HTML entity. There are triangles that point to the left. We'll skip that for now because it's getting a little bit too much, but actually you can leave it like this. I think it looks fine. This icon is just an indicator that you can hover it for more items, right? So it's not that important, but that's how you would open it on the left side. I'm going to undo that. We'll leave it on the right side for now. So it's going to be top 0, left 100%, right? Now it's not going to be there for long because now we're going to make it responsive. We're going to make it a responsive submenu. So I'm going to go into the inspector tools here again, going to responsive. We're going to start off very wide here because already in the beginning, last time we had some issues because you can have, you know, more text here, right? So you already get sort of issues here on wider viewports even. So you can see here as well that on wider viewports, you already get very close to the edge, right? Especially if you're watching this on a smaller laptop, you would have already seen this. So what we're going to do is right when we're also changing the dropdown itself to be more to the left, we're also going to make this open on the left side, right? So we can go back to our previous media query here. We were already changing the position of the dropdown list. Now we're going to do with this the same with the submenu list. We're actually just going to open it up on the left side. So we have to reset that left property. And then we can say it should sit 100% from the right. And that will, yeah, so then you can see here, it's actually very nice, responsive. It will simply point more to the inwards. All right, so that should look pretty good for a very long time. So let's see. Eventually, at some point, we're changing the layout here. Yeah, so here we're changing the layout. The dropdown becomes the full width here, right below the header content. So now when we click on this, right, or when we hover on this, maybe very small device, very small laptops, perhaps. But when we click on this on a mobile, it should open up. Right, that's how it works. The hover will become a click on mobile. So what you can do, right, in 650 pixels, we can do the same as for the drop down. We're gonna make it 100% width, and it should be below there. So we need to change a couple of things. Let me actually make this a little bit smaller. Yeah. So here, what we can say is we're going to change the position again. So the width should become 100%. It should sit 100% from the top and 0 from the left. And we need to reset the right property. So essentially, we're just changing the position with top, left, and right. So sometimes you have to reset something from the past, and we have to change some other things, right? So you can play around with these numbers. This is what it comes down to. We need to have 100% width so that it actually stretches all the way. And then we have a very cool submenu that's responsive, right? So if I click out of here, it also disappears, right? Which is what we want. When I click out of here, the whole dropdown disappears, right? So this is a pretty advanced responsive dropdown with submenu. So well done for making it this far. It's actually quite tricky to code this from scratch. But if it's working for you, very well done. Let me double check one more time. Yeah, let's go to iPhone 12 Pro. I'm going to open up the drop down and then the submenu. Yeah, it's all working. So you can see it's pretty advanced here. And it's really important that you have mastered the underlying fundamentals if you work as a web developer. So definitely check out my CSS as well as my JavaScript course. We're going to build some beautiful projects step by step, and you'll learn much more like Flexbox, CSS grid, animations, and transitions. In the CSS course in JavaScript, you'll learn all the modern JavaScript concepts like arrow functions, const versus let, and a lot of advanced things as well. Really building beautiful projects from scratch so you can see how everything fits together. So definitely check out those courses. The links are in the description. As for this project, well, very well done. This was pretty advanced already. And it's very difficult to code this from scratch. So well done. And let me know what you think in the comment section.
By the way, if this was helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Also, check out my courses on CSS and JavaScript if you want to take those skills to an advanced level. Because in there, we will build some beautiful real-world projects from scratch so you can see how everything fits together and really master CSS or JavaScript. And I will also release other courses soon like React and Node.js. So if you want to be notified, then make sure you are subscribed to the email newsletter. You can find the link in the description. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon.